Hi, today we're looking at our second great prayer of the Bible, which is the prayer of Nehemiah, which is the prayer for passion. And here we see a man who was one of the exiles living in the palace in Baghdad, and he heard the story of how the people were in Jerusalem, and the report was that that the walls had been broken down, the gates had been burned, and the people were in great distress. And so Nehemiah hears this and he's just moved so deeply, and he falls on his knees in prayer to God. He calls out to God. And let me just read from Nehemiah chapter 1. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down and its gates have been burned with fire. When I heard these things, I sat down and wept. For some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. Now, Nehemiah, this is a story of prayer. It begins in prayer. There's actually 14 prayers through the book of Nehemiah. And at different stages, we see Nehemiah coming before God in prayer, and this same rhythm that we see in these great prayers of looking up, looking within, looking without. And so Nehemiah is praying to God, and he prays in verse 5, Lord, the God of heaven, the great and awesome God who keeps his covenant of love with those who love him and keeps his commandments. So he's looking up, he's saying, God, this is not right what's happening. And you are the God who keeps his covenant of love. So verse 6, he says, let your ear be attentive and your eyes open to hear the prayer your servant is praying before you day and night for your servants, the people of Israel. So we look up praying to God. Now the prayer moves on to the looking within. And he says in verse 6, I confess the sins we Israelites, including myself and my father's family, have committed against you. We've acted very wickedly towards you. We have not obeyed the commands, decrees and laws you gave your servant Moses. It's interesting that Nehemiah prays we, and he's not praying you. He could have quite easily come in and said, coming in from the palace, said you people. But he actually said we have sinned against you. Now, I suspect that this is not the sins of commission, which is the sins of commission are the things that we do wrong, but more the sins of omission, the things we don't do. And I'm sure that God was calling his people to rally together, to rebuild, to restore. And for whatever reason, it wasn't happening. They weren't able to do it. And so this is the prayer of confession that God, for whatever reason, we haven't been able to respond to how you're leading. And so we confess our sin of this, God. And this great work that Nehemiah did was not just rebuilding walls. He was actually being used by God to rebuild the people. In verse 8, Nehemiah says, remember the instruction you gave your servant Moses, saying, if you are unfaithful, I'll scatter you among the nations. But if you return to me and obey my commands, then even if your exiled people are at the farthest horizon, I'll gather them from there and bring them to the place I have chosen as a dwelling for my name. Verse 11, Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of this your servant and to the prayer of your servants who delight in revering your name. So Nehemiah is praying this prayer of confession, and now he's saying, God, this is looking out now, God, rebuild, refocus us, build us as your people. This great prayer of Nehemiah is really about firing up the passion. And we at Waverley Salvation Army, we want to pray this prayer. We want to come together and rebuild and restore. In Isaiah 58 verses 11 and 12, there are these words, and we'll use this as a prayer to conclude. The Lord will guide you always. He will satisfy your needs in a sun-scorched land, and he will strengthen your frame. You'll be like a well-watered garden, like a spring whose waters never fail. Your people will rebuild the ancient ruins and will raise up the age-old foundations. You will be called repairer of broken walls, restorer of streets with dwelling. This is God's story for the church. This is God's story for his people, that we rally together and by his power and his timing and his plan and purpose, we rebuild, we restore. But it begins with prayer, it's fueled by prayer, and it's the power of God is released through prayer.